Well, hello, and an extremely warm, a bit dishevelled, an extremely warm welcome to my channel. I'm Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome if you're a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you've decided to tune in to my musings / wafflings / meanderings for the very first time. So I would describe August as a really mixed reading month. I've read some belters, but I've also read a few books that, one in particular that I maybe shouldn't have stuck with right to the end. So I feel it's like quite a mixed bunch of books that I'm presenting you with. And there's also quite a mixture of sort of, I was going to say fiction and non-fiction, that's not quite right. But the very first, let's just get on with it, Louise. The very first book that I'm going to talk to you about was the first book that I read this month. And it was Mary Beard's SPQR, which I had not actually got round to reading, even though I've had it on my shelves for quite some time. And having interviewed Mary Beard with Simon Savage, my son, earlier this year, not that long ago, within the last few months, it inspired me to read this. And I really, really recommend it. If you are somebody who knows very little about ancient Rome, it's a really good introduction to the sort of chronology of the history, but it does so much more than that. It's called SPQR because that stands for Senatus Populusque Romani, so the Senate and the people of Rome. And that was a kind of, that was, those letters were imprinted on the Roman legions, etc., etc. So Mary Beard, I find her historical writing really, really engaging. I mean, it's so well researched. It's quite a tome, this, but I feel that it's very readable, and maybe would be, if you haven't read Emperors of Rome, which is her most recent book, it might be worth reading this first to kind of set the scene. One of the things I loved about it is that it tackles some very contemporary questions. So it looks at things like migration and social mobility and, you know, aspects of the ancient Romans that perhaps are more pertinent to our worldview today and the issues that we're perhaps interested in. So I really enjoyed that, and I really loved the sort of chapters towards the end where it was looking at the impact of Rome on the wider world, which I don't think gets tackled enough in books of this caliber. So yeah, absolutely, fully recommend, and really enjoyed it. And now I'm going to put it down because it's actually really heavy. And then I picked up Devvoted Ladies by Molly Keane. Now this is a book that I've scribbled in the front, shouldn't have stuck with it, and I really shouldn't. I think if you're interested in the sort of 1930s and Art Deco and decadence, which I am, but I think if you want to read something that immerses you in that period, then this might be the book for you. But I found it, my biggest issue with it really was it starts in London at a party, and there were so many characters, and I really, really struggled to distinguish between them. And I found that all the way through the novel. I didn't feel I really got to know any specific character in enough detail to kind of hang the plot on. And there isn't much of a plot here either, I didn't feel. It's the story of these two women, Jessica and I want to say Jane, I can't remember, one of them's American, and Sylvester, their friend, is concerned about them because he feels that one is manipulating the other, and they're clearly in some sort of lesbian relationship, which again thought was quite interesting for the time. It's never explicitly stated, but it's sort of made apparent. And there's also a character who's quite clearly gay in here, and again it's not a male who's, it's not explicitly stated. So I thought for the time of writing, you know, that was quite interesting that she felt she could, you know, write about the LGBT community, as it were, at the time. But that doesn't particularly, I didn't feel that had a bearing on the novel, and that's a side note in a way. And basically the novel starts in London, moves to Ireland, which I believe Molly Keane was Irish. It moves to the west coast of Ireland and looks at, it's social satire, so she satirises society in London, and then the plot takes the characters to the west of Ireland, where the sort of the rural rich are satirized as well. But I just found it, I don't know, it doesn't, nothing really has stuck in my memory, as you can probably tell by the way I'm talking about it. And I was really disappointed because I'd heard quite a lot about Molly Keane, and you know, was looking forward to reading something by her, but it just didn't do it. I'm going to shut up about it now. It didn't do it for me. And then I read The Kiss by Joan Lingard, and I've already made a little video about this because this was my book of the month. I really, this came as a big surprise to me in a way. I used to teach a book called Across the Barricades, which was a novel written for teenagers by Joan Lingard years ago in schools. And I hadn't appreciated that she'd written for adults. And I'd picked this up in a secondhand bookshop, particularly because I really like Rodin's sculpture. And The Kiss, as depicted on here, is one of his most famous sculptures. And it's the story of an art teacher. He's a sculptor himself. He creates his own work. And the novel opens with him and his wife driving off in 2 different cars. He's got the son in the back. She's got the daughter in the back of hers. They're clearly moving house. But what you don't realise immediately is that they're moving to separate houses because the marriage has gone awry. And the reason that the marriage has gone awry is because Cormac has got himself into a bit of a problem with one of his students on a school trip to Paris. And as a former teacher, I really appreciated the way that the sort of the pressures and the difficulties of taking a group of teenagers abroad can pan out, and I thought she wrote about that extremely well. The novel's set in Edinburgh, so you walk the streets of Edinburgh and you also walk the streets of Paris. There's lots in it about Rodin and about Gwen John as well, because one of his students is obsessed with her. And I just really enjoyed it. I thought the relationships in it were really, really well drawn. It's not just about him and his situation at work. It's also about the relationship with his wife and the way that their marriage is broken down. And I thought that was described really well. And equally, the impact on the 2 children. So he has a daughter who is, I think she's just finishing her A-levels, so she's that kind of age. And then, so sort of 17, 18. He's got a son who's still just at primary school, so he's about 10, 11 years old. And the way that both of them have their own story arc, particularly the daughter, I thought was very clever. And it's not a massive novel, you know, the font's quite big. It's you know, and you can see the pages aren't sort of absolutely chock full of words. But she doesn't half pack an awful lot in this book, and I don't know why it's not had more attention. I'm really quite fascinated by it. And then I read this, which you will have seen, I suspect, a lot. If you follow social media, I've seen this a lot on Instagram, and there was a big sort of flurry. It's Carla by Colin Walsh. And I really, you know, just the cover, I remember buying this. The cover drew my attention because you've got these young people in a beautiful summer cornfield, but one of the faces has been scribbled out in the photograph, and photographs are really important in this story. So Carla is the central character in this novel. She has the novel opens with a group of sort of 30-year-olds who have come back to the west of Ireland for a wedding. And when they were 15, they were really close friends, but Carla disappeared. And the disappearance is unravelled as the novel progresses. Now, this is a very, very highly plot-driven novel. I don't want to say too much because I'm really, really worried that I'll give spoilers away. I couldn't put this down. I would describe this as a brilliant holiday read because it's very compelling. And you get, you know, you're constantly inside each of the different characters. There's this group of friends and you flip between each of the characters' heads. One of them is a rock star, don't let that put you off. One of them is a journalist. You know, they all come from, they've all gone off and done very different things. One of them has sort of stayed at home and worked in a tea shop. So they're all really different, but they have this one bond, which is Carla and their relationships with her. And as the story progresses, we find out what has happened to Carla. And yeah, and the writing is so good. I think Colin Walsh's writing is superb. You know, his descriptions of just about anything, you know, the locations, the characters, there are lots of different settings. There's a cafe, there's an old house, there's this kind of ranch type farm, and all of those settings have really stayed in my head. There's quite a lot of violence and brutality in it. It's not for the faint-hearted, this book, but I really recommend it if you want some sort of thrillery, plot-driven thing. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up on the TV screens. It reminds me very much of a lot of series that I'm very guilty of binge watching. It was a bit like watching telly reading this in a good way. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it. And then I read Akwaeke Emezi's Bitter. Now, again, this novel ostensibly is teen fiction, but I don't really know what that means. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a novel that focuses on Bitter. She's a very artistic, very creative young woman who has grown up in foster care, been passed around from pillar to post. Her father was a monster, and there's a lot in this novel about what makes a monster, who are monsters, you know, and looking at society. And she's a young woman who is absolutely thrilled because she's got a sort of scholarship's not the right word, but she's been accepted into this art community, this college, Eucalyptus, where she's going to be able to find her feet and meet lots of new people and create art. And like the other novel, Pet, which Akwaeke Emezi wrote as a teen novel, there are some brilliant descriptions in here, absolutely superb, of kind of art coming to life, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think the way that Akwaeke writes about art is absolutely wonderful. And in the novel, Bitter and her friends are under pressure by the older adults in society to go out and protest against the government, and they are becoming involved in militant activity. And Bitter really resists that. And she's got, you know, she's really frightened of going out into the streets and getting involved. So there's an awful lot in here about peer pressure, about societal pressure. And I loved the way that Akwaeke described the society that they're in this community, in the art school. Every sort of brand of sexuality and gender is completely accepted and normal. And in that sense, it's kind of utopian in a really positive, that, you know, relationships are described as if everything is accepted within that community. And yet in the wider community, there are these very scarily named queer hostels. So I think Akwaeke is looking at the difference between the youth of today and the attitudes maybe of people of my kind of age, the world that we've grown up in, and how they the friction between those two things in terms of gender and sexuality. And I found that very interesting. You know, again, I tore through this book. What a beautiful cover, by the way, isn't it? Look at that. It shines and it shimmers. And yeah, I loved it. Really enjoyed it. And then I went to Simon Armitage's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I felt I needed to read something a bit more archaic. And this is a pretty archaic because it was written in about 1400, I think, by an anonymous poet. And Armitage has sort of translated it into modern English. And oh my God, he does it beautifully. I mean, this is a story that I have read many times in different versions, but I have never enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it this time round. So we're at the court of King Arthur. This Green Knight turns up, throws down the gauntlet, offers a challenge, and only Sir Gawain is brave enough to accept the challenge. And basically he's got to meet up, he's got to find the Green Knight in a year's time, and he's basically got to confront his own death. And he goes on this quest. There are lots and lots of hunting scenes in here. Now, I don't personally agree with hunting. I find it all, in the modern world, I find it all a bit disturbing. But in the context of this story, of course, it was a very ordinary pursuit for the upper classes. So so there are lots and lots of descriptions of hunting in here, which I think are just brilliantly done. The energy and the speed and the pace of it is fantastic. And I just loved Simon Armitage is a poet laureate in the UK. He's one of my favourite contemporary poets, and he's from the north of England. So the language that he uses is very sort of raw and witty, and it's full of the most amazing sort of alliteration. The soundscapes in this are brilliant. I found it really, really compelling. I recommend it very highly. And then this, have not read. This was my first ever Benjamin Myers book. It's The Gallows Pole. And other people said to me, oh, you should read Cuddy first, or you should read... But I don't know why. I think it's the cover. It really haunted me, and I've been wanting to get to read this for quite a long time. I bought it a while ago, probably over a year ago now. And my goodness, was it worth the wait? And actually, it was brilliant going from, you know, the northern gritty poetry of Simon Armitage to Benjamin Myers' writing, because he's writing about the north of England, the area around Halifax in Yorkshire, and he's telling the story of this King David, who it's the 1700s, it's Yorkshire. He is like a what's the word, he's like a gang leader, I suppose. He wouldn't look out of place in a sort of modern gang. He's got real charisma. He manages to persuade the people in his community, and it's a really widespread rural community. You walk miles in this novel, you travel miles on foot, and I really want to go back to Todmorden and those sorts of places in Yorkshire to look at this landscape again, because I even found myself, from those books, I got an OS map out and I was looking at all the different places while I was reading the novel. It really, really interested me in the Yorkshire landscape. It absolutely oozes that in here, and the kind of rawness of it. And King David's language, the idiolect that Benjamin Myers gives him, is so full of really foul swear words and violence and aggression. And anyway, so King David is this very charismatic leader. He manages to persuade the local people to bring their coins, and they clip the coins and then they melt them down and remake coins. So they're doing something highly illegal, but it's kind of a little bit Robin Hood in that he is doing it to ensure that his community survives. It's just the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and the landlords are sweeping in, claiming land that has been common land up to this point. And he knows that their future is under threat and they're not going to be able to make money because they have survived on weaving. So every house has a loom, they weave by hand, and the Industrial Revolution is going to come in and threaten him. And it's called the Gallows Pole because he is sort of counting down his days to ending up on the gallows pole, which is a reference to being hung. Now, the other stroke of genius about this book, it's not only the most beautiful, poetic descriptions of the landscape and raw and atmospheric, but Benjamin Myers has used conventional narrative. So you've got sort of third-person narration, but that's interspersed with King's own voice, King David's own voice, and also historical records and documents as well. And he looks at, you know, the common person, the common man on the land is described as being so violent and brutal and primitive in many ways, but the landlords also in their own way are just as, it's masked, but they are just as brutal as the sort of more barbaric appearing poor folk on the land. And I really enjoyed the way that Benjamin Myers exposed that. For me, this is historical fiction at its best, because he is restoring the story, because this is all based on true story, and he's giving voice to a community that would not, the majority of people would not have been able to read or write. So there's no no easy record of what happened to them. And I love the way that he's kind of restored their voice. I found that very powerful. I also loved the way that all humanity is in here. So there are children in this story who are important. David King's wife is a very important character in the story. So I really like that as well, the way that he sort of manages to capture a whole community in one novel. Thoroughly loved it. And then I read, it's a bit like What Did I Do in My Holidays? And then I read A Grand Tour of the Roman Empire by Marcus Sidonius Fulks. Well, he's a fictional character. It's really written by Jerry Toner, who is a Cambridge Don. And he wrote a book, I think he's written several about, which are ostensibly by Marcus Sidonius Fulks. The one that I've read is about, it's a manual for keeping slaves, and I read it some years ago and absolutely loved it. It's very tongue-in-cheek, but it's beautifully researched as well, because he's an expert in all of this stuff. So he takes Marcus Sidonius Fulks, aka Jerry Toner, takes us on a journey through the Roman Empire. Marcus goes on this journey, which takes him to where does it take him? It takes him all the way down the south coast of Italy. It takes him into Greece. It takes him to Egypt. It takes him all over the place, to Antioch. And so you're learning about the ancient world and all these different places and sites and so on. But it's fictionalized. And it's done so brilliantly. I mean, obviously having studied classics, I can see where Toner is actually paraphrasing Pliny or various other, Roman writers as he goes. And he at the end of each chapter, he then has a section where he talks about the different sources that have informed that chapter, which I thought was really brilliant. And Fulks is kind of quite snooty and he's very, very proud of all the Roman achievements, and he looks down his nose on things. So, he's really, really engaging. And I think if you're interested in the ancient world, but you don't want to read non-fiction, this is the kind of thing that could really help. I mean, there's all sorts of really interesting stuff about how you get from A to B in the ancient world, travelling by boat and so on. There's lots and lots of different ways that he travels. And you also learn lots of bits of Roman history as well. So there you go. Really loved that. And then my final read for August. Oh my God, this book. So it's The Little Red Chairs by Edna O'Brien. And I picked this up, or Brien. I picked this up because she died recently. And I realised I've only read one of her books, which was one of her most recent, might have been the last book she wrote. I'm not sure. It's called Girl. And I remember that as being a very powerful read. So it's got absolutely beautiful cover. Look at that, all those wonderful autumn leaves. And if I just read you a bit from the introduction, it says, on the 6th of April 2012, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the start of the siege of Sarajevo by Bosnian Serb forces, 11,541 red chairs were laid out in rows along the 800 metres of the Sarajevo High Street. One empty chair for every Sarajevan killed during the 1,425 days of siege. 643 small chairs represented the children killed by snipers and the heavy artillery fired from the surrounding mountains. Now that image of the chairs immediately explains the title. For me, I visited Sarajevo in the early 1980s and was really... it was a very, very memorable 3 or 4 days that I spent there. And so when the Bosnian War broke out in the 90s, it had a real sort of impact on me, and I followed it very closely. And I've always sort of found literature. I loved Priscilla Morris's Black Butterflies book that was shortlisted for the Women's Prize last year, I think it was. Again, it's set in Sarajevo. So immediately, I think that's probably why I picked this book up originally. And what's extraordinary about this book is it's actually a story, largely speaking, of a small community in the west of Ireland with a priest and they go poaching. It's a very kind of stereotypically sort of small Irish community, it strikes me, and you're thinking, what the hell has this got to do with Sarajevo? But this man arrives into the community and he's looking for somewhere to stay, and he's presenting himself as this kind of mystic, and one of the women in the community becomes sort of obsessed. Her marriage is rather cold, and she's lonely, and so she sort of comes into this guy's thrall, and so do lots of other members of the community. He completely mesmerizes them. And then there's I've got to be very, very careful what I say. I think you can kind of imagine where it's headed, but you sort of know that when you start reading it. This book starts off with this cozy Irish community, and I found it a very challenging read because it's really bleak. It disturbed me a lot. It looks at the power of an individual to manipulate a small community, hundreds and thousands of people. It's so clever, and again, you know, the prose is beautifully written. Would I recommend it? I think that's really hard. I think, you know, I wouldn't want to read it again. I would not want to read it again because I found it a very difficult read, because of the sort of brutality behind what's happening here. And if anyone has read this book, I'd be very interested to see what you think of it. And I think her message, you know, I mean, it really looks at who can we trust, how do people come along who manage to gain such power and sway over vast numbers of people. It looks at loneliness and vulnerability, and misjudgment that we make as humans. It's a really clever, intelligent, brilliant book, but I wouldn't want to read it again. Anyway, that's how August finished up for me. So I've turned to, I've actually just started a very pacey, short 1940s thriller because I just felt I needed something as a bit of an antidote to this, having finished it. Anyway, I hope you've been reading wonderful things in August. Happy reading, everybody. Take care, and speak to you very soon. Bye.